Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Before we begin today's The Hindu analysis, let me remind you that if you're finding our initiatives to be helpful, do let us know by liking the videos, by sharing your comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from page number 8 of the Delhi edition. This article examines how we can make use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to speed up the judicial process in order to clear the pendency of cases. See, the emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning has opened up infinite possibilities in each and every sector. These technologies can have a multiplier effect on increasing the efficiency of any sector or industry. Even though the usage of these technologies have raised a few concerns, if they are applied effectively and judiciously, they can bring about transformative and incremental changes across several key sectors, including manufacturing, agriculture, services, and as well as in governance, administration, and judiciary. But of course, before we consider applying such technologies in key sectors, it's very important to identify the specific challenges, concerns, and problems facing each sector. Based on this understanding, the AI architecture can be customized to each sector in order to ensure that it delivers the highest impact. Specifically with regard to justice delivery system, AI and machine learning technologies can be applied across multiple stages in the judicial process, which can help in scaling up the capacity of the judicial system, which in turn will help in reducing the backlog of cases, which is a critical challenge that is affecting justice delivery in our country. See, as per latest data from the National Judicial Data Grid, nearly 3.89 crore cases are pending at the lower courts, and around 5.8 million cases are pending at the high courts. Then, even at the Supreme Court, several lakhs of cases are pending, which has not only affected the quality of justice in India, but has also ended up denying justice to several people. So, this massive backlog of cases has directly affected the efficiency of Indian judiciary, and the challenge could be addressed with the application of technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning. For example, in the judicial process, first you can identify the various legal processes and the stages where these technologies can be applied. Through a sophisticated AI algorithm, an automated machine can be created, which will first start learning and perceiving about the judicial process. Such an algorithm can take up incremental learning or step-by-step learning, and with each step in process, it can gain more information about the system and about how the judicial process actually works, in order to later identify and automate certain aspects of judicial system. For example, an AI algorithm can be designed which can extract certain facts from a legal document. The program can be designed in such a way that it can learn and understand the key facts present in a legal document. Such a self-learning algorithm can learn over a period of time, and as it gains more experience, it can start making accurate predictions and interventions, which can make the entire judicial system intelligent over a period of time. So if we can ensure that such a smart algorithm is free from any biases or prejudices, then such a smart algorithm driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning can constantly nurture the judicial ecosystem to automate certain processes in order to improve the efficiency of the judiciary. In fact, the Indian judiciary has already taken several steps in this regard, and recently the Supreme Court of India has launched a complex AI tool named as SUPES. It stands for Supreme Court Portal for Assistance in Court Efficiency. This AI-driven system has been designed to understand the judicial processes, and through a process of self-learning, it can start identifying the areas which requires automation. This can assist the court in improving its efficiency and reducing the pendency of cases, in combination with another AI system that has been commissioned by the Supreme Court. SUVAS is an AI system that can assist in the translation of judgments into regional vernacular languages, And this in itself is a landmark step towards increasing accessibility to justice. So such AI machine learning technologies, when applied in combination, they can reduce the time taken for the movement of a file and also significantly assist the court in fast-tracking justice, thereby helping build an efficient fast-track judicial system. In fact, through these couple of initiatives, the Supreme Court of India has already emerged as a global front runner in the application of these technologies to speed up the judicial processes. However, there is still tremendous scope to further scale up the application of these technologies because platforms like Supace and Suvas, which are currently being used, they only scratch the surface of artificial intelligence, and we are yet to tap the full potential of these technologies when it comes to fast tracking our judicial system. And we should also note that these technologies can be used not just by the courts, but also by law firms and legal professionals. It can help lawyers, legal advisors, and law firms to automate several tasks and thereby help them to creatively solve legal issues and invest more energy and resources to fast track the cases. So essentially, these technologies can help both the judges and as well as the legal professionals in identifying the pending cases, in automating certain judicial tasks. It could also help in translation of legal documents. It could also help in identifying judicial precedents from previous judgments, thereby helping in developing better legal reasoning and legal discussion and interpretation of laws. But of course, employing these technologies will also raise a lot of concerns, not just with regard to its complexity and sophistication, but also with regard to its potential misuse. So this will give rise to concerns about data protection, data privacy, and human rights, and possible misuse of these systems to derail the judicial process. So these ethical concerns will also have to be addressed by the legal system, and this would require external regulation of the technologies through a law passed by the legislature, which will provide for the rules and regulatory guidelines. But one thing is for sure, as these technologies evolve and as they are increasingly applied in governance and in judiciary, it will lead to greater collaboration between the state institutions and the private technology institutions. And this will go a long way in churning out more sophisticated machines, which can help address the critical challenges that have been plaguing our judicial and administrative system. Now, this topic is in news because this question was recently raised in the Parliament to the Union Law Minister. It was an unstarred question submitted by an MP who asked, can AI and machine learning put judiciary on the fast track? To this, the Union Law Minister replied that certain aspects of these technologies are already being used in the judicial system. For example, in implementing phase 2 of the e-courts project. The e-courts project, which has been in implementation since 2015, has helped in digitization of court records. And with the breakout of the pandemic, digitization of courts and virtual court hearings have become the norm. And this further highlights the potential for technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, which can transform legal cases and judicial proceedings. As discussed, the Supreme Court of India has already taken a few steps in this regard, including the deployment of few platforms like Suvas and Supace, along with constituting the Artificial Intelligence Committee to chart a way forward for the adoption of AI and machine learning in India's judicial process. Even private law firms are already experimenting with these technologies for data analysis and for automating the review of legal documents and for looking out for judicial precedents in past cases. So even as the Indian judiciary is making strides in this regard, in other countries like US, automated judicial decision-making systems were used to decide on routine bail applications without any human involvement. So such automation without the human element, that too in judicial decision-making, had also raised a controversy, whereas a few other countries like Estonia have adopted AI and machine learning in a major way in their judicial process. So these examples in India and around the world illustrate that there definitely exists tremendous potential for these technologies to bring about a transformative change in our judicial process. But however, the concerns, the risks, and the ethical challenges will have to be addressed through laws and through adequate regulations. Next, we have a few important articles in today's newspaper related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. According to this article on page number 1, Russian President Putin has warned the NATO countries against imposing any no-fly zone over Ukraine. So we need to understand what exactly is a no-fly zone. So let's talk about this in detail and then come back to these articles. See, a no-fly zone, or also referred to as an air exclusion zone, is a particular region or an area which has been designated by a military power as a no-flight zone, meaning no aircraft, especially specified aircrafts, cannot enter this region which has been designated as a no-flight or a no-fly zone. This restriction could apply to both civilian aircraft and as well as to military aircraft. If any aircraft violates the airspace which has been designated as a no-fly zone, then the military power is going to enforce the guideline through a militarist strategy in order to coercively enforce the guidelines. It essentially means that if an aircraft were to violate the no-fly zone, then the military power will have the right to either intercept the aircraft or even to shoot it down by either scrambling its own fighter jets or by deploying its air defense missile systems. In the past, such no-fly zones have been established by NATO over Iraq during the Gulf War of 1990 and as well as over Bosnia-Herzegovina during the Kosovo War of 1995 and more recently over Libya during the 2011 military intervention by US, UK and France. Now, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukrainian president has been requesting NATO to enforce such a no-fly zone over Ukraine so that no Russian aircraft are allowed into Ukrainian airspace, which currently are carrying out airstrikes and bombardment against Ukraine. This is the reason why Ukraine wants a no-fly zone to be established over its airspace. It has been calling upon NATO countries to declare the Ukrainian airspace as a no-fly zone, as currently Ukraine is facing a brutal missile attack and airstrikes by the Russian Air Force, which reportedly have even targeted civilian areas, cities and civilian infrastructure. These aerial bombings and air raids by Russian forces has reportedly caused significant damage, and hence if a no-fly zone is declared by the NATO countries, it would be an open challenge to the Russian Air Force, which could possibly help in preventing the bombardment of Ukraine. But if NATO were to impose such a no-fly zone, then it essentially means that the NATO will also have to enforce it. Meaning, if the Russian Air Force were to violate the no-fly zone, and if its fighter jets and transport aircraft enter Ukrainian airspace, then NATO will have to shoot them down either by scrambling its own fighter jets to intercept the planes or by launching air defense missiles from the ground, which would essentially bring the NATO countries into a direct conflict with Russia. Because any such enforcement of a no-fly zone would definitely be treated by Russia as an act of war, thus risking the escalation of conflict between Russia and the NATO countries. Then more importantly, we have to note that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. NATO countries have an obligation to defend each other, but this NATO protection applies only for member states and not for non-member states like Ukraine. And also the root cause of the current Russian invasion into Ukraine is primarily the stand that Russia has taken against the expansion of NATO towards Eastern Europe. So all these factors have led NATO to be very reluctant when it comes to meeting this demand from Ukraine of declaring a no-fly zone over Ukrainian airspace. In previous conflicts involving Iraq, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Libya, NATO countries quickly enforced a no-fly zone because none of them are nuclear weapon states. But however, this is not the case with Russia. Russia possesses nuclear weapons, and if NATO were to declare a no-fly zone, and if it were to enforce it by shooting down Russian aircraft, Russia would treat it as an act of war, and it is definitely going to escalate the conflict against other European countries maybe even against the United States, which are members of the NATO. So these fears of an escalation of the conflict, which could potentially involve countries possessing nuclear weapons, is an extremely risky action, and hence NATO has refused to oblige by the demand of Ukraine to enforce a no-fly zone over the country. In response to these demands from Ukraine, Russian President Putin has made it clear that any third party involvement in the conflict or any declaration of a no fly zone over Ukraine and its possible enforcement will be treated by Russia as an act of war, thereby sending out a direct threat to the NATO countries to not interfere directly in the conflict. Now let's look at this column from page number 11, which examines the creeping eastward expansion of NATO. See, the NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is essentially a military alliance of 30 countries from Europe and North America. It includes 28 members from Europe and two North American members, that is, United States and Canada. The purpose of this military alliance is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. This grouping was formed in 1949 after the end of the Second World War, and it was established as a direct response to the Cold War, which had begun between the US-led superpower bloc and the Soviet Union-led power bloc. Intense geopolitical rivalry had broken out between these two power blocs, which represented two radically different ideologies, that is, democracy and capitalism, represented by the US power bloc, and communism and socialism, represented by the Soviet power bloc. As these rivalries translated into an arms race and also into covert proxy wars, the two sides started forming their own military alliances. So the first step was taken by the United States and the West European countries, which formed the NATO, that initially included West European countries as their members. So countries like UK, Netherlands, West Germany, Belgium, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and the others were all part of the NATO that was led by the United States. The primary objective of this grouping was not just to counter the Soviet Union, but also to counter the revival of nationalist militarism in Europe, which had been the primary cause for the world wars, and also to promote and encourage the political integration of the European continent. These NATO member countries were mandated to take up certain responsibilities, which included the organization of collective security and defense of the member countries. It mandates the grouping and the members to take all possible measures to protect the other member states from any external threats, and the members are mandated to spend at least around 2% of their national GDP on defense every year. Specifically, Article 5 of the treaty highlights how this grouping arranges collective security and defense of the members. This article states that an attack against one member or one ally is considered as an attack against all allies. It essentially calls for all the members to come to the defense of the other NATO member. But till date, this article has been invoked only once. That was after the 9/11 attacks carried out by the Al Qaeda against the United States. Following these terror attacks, the US declared a global war on terrorism, and by invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty, all the other members also joined this US-led global war on terror. But however, it is also possible for the alliance to take collective defense and security measures even without invoking Article 5. So during the Cold War era, as this geopolitical grouping was quickly turning into a military alliance that provided for collective defense, the then Soviet Union countered this by working out its own treaty known as the Warsaw Pact. This brought the Soviet Union into a close military and political alliance with several Central and Eastern European countries, such as Poland, East Germany, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Bulgaria, and the others. So this essentially divided Europe and led to the emergence of the Iron Curtain that divided West Europe from Central and Eastern Europe. While the Soviet Union exercised considerable influence across these regions from 1950s to 1970s, this alliance known as the Warsaw Pact eventually started to collapse with the political and economic decline of the Soviet power bloc. By 1980s, the Warsaw Pact had started to weaken, and by late 80s and early 90s, the Warsaw Pact fell apart and also the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, leading to the formation of several new independent countries in Eastern Europe. Following this collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, which was very insecure about its influence, had obtained a commitment from the United States that it is not going to push the NATO to expand into Eastern Europe. The then Russian leaders of 1990s took this commitment very seriously, as they saw it as a guarantee to protect their influence in Eastern Europe, and this was entirely based on the commitment of the US and the NATO to not expand the organization eastwards. But contrary to this commitment, many Central and East European countries were brought under NATO, and between late 1990s and 2020, many countries in the region have joined NATO, including former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and former members of Warsaw Pact such as Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the others. Most recently in 2020, North Macedonia also joined the NATO. Then in 2008, the same offer was made to Georgia and as well as to Ukraine. So this continuing creeping expansionism of NATO is what spooked Russia and President Putin. And since the last couple of decades, Russia has been retaliating against this. For example, when NATO membership was offered to Georgia, Russia invaded the country and occupied a few key territories. Similarly, when Ukraine became increasingly aligned with the NATO, Russia invaded the country in 2014 and it annexed the Crimean Peninsula over here. And to further destabilize Ukraine, Russia even sponsored a separatist war in eastern Ukraine in the Donbas region. And now, as the NATO and Ukraine were not responding to Russian demands to stop this creeping expansionism of the NATO, Russia has decided to retaliate with a full-fledged war against Ukraine. While this is no justification for the Russian aggression, it does help explain why Russia is so sensitive towards NATO expansion towards Central and Eastern Europe, and also helps us understand why NATO has taken in many of these former members of the Warsaw Pact. Now let's take up another column from page number 11, which examines the impact of Western sanctions against Russia and how this could possibly lead to a global commodity crunch with the potential of a long-term impact on the supply of wheat, oil, metals, and other goods. See, ever since Russia stepped up its aggression against Ukraine and invaded the country, Western countries led by US have imposed a wide set of sweeping and punitive economic sanctions. These economic sanctions have been primarily led by the US and the European Union, along with their allies such as Japan, Canada, and the United Kingdom. These sanctions consist of a list of economic, banking, and trade sanctions against Russia, and it not just targets the Russian economy in general, but it also specifically targets the Russian president himself and other top officials and ministers of the Russian government, along with prominent businessmen, Russian banks, and Russian private companies as well. These sanctions by the Western countries have been designed to hit the Russian economy hard, and they are unveiling these sanctions in a step-by-step manner so that they can use it as a deterrent against any further Russian escalation. So for now, they have announced a few rounds of sanctions and they are holding back on the rest so that it can act as a deterrent against any further Russian aggression and could be used in a step-by-step escalatory manner if Russia were also to escalate the conflict. One set of sanctions have been designed to target the Russian financial and banking system and to disrupt its ability to carry out international financial transactions. To achieve this, a few Russian banks and institutions are being banned from SWIFT, which stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is a global platform for executing international financial transactions and payments between banks around the world. The SWIFT payment gateway, which is largely maintained by the Western countries, currently facilitates transactions around the world and more than 200 countries are dependent on the system entirely. But now Russian banks are being specifically targeted, and around 7 major Russian banks have been thrown out of the SWIFT payment gateway, which essentially means that these institutions cannot initiate any foreign transactions, and it is going to directly affect the ability of the Russian economy to interact and transact with the rest of the world. Similar sanctions that were previously imposed against Iran had crippled nearly one-third of its economy, and a majority of its foreign trade and foreign transactions were affected because of keeping the country away from the SWIFT payment gateway. Along with this, the Western countries have designed a wide set of banking restrictions to target specific Russian banks. The Office of Foreign Assets Control of the US Treasury Department has announced some of these banking restrictions, which takes the sanctions regime beyond the SWIFT boycott. These banking restrictions have been aimed at 3 major Russian banking institutions, such as the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, the National Wealth Fund of the Russian Federation, and the Russian Finance Ministry, and prohibits them from accessing all US dollar denominated bonds, foreign exchange reserves, and other financial instruments. The US government has asked all its financial institutions to close these banking routes for Russian banks within 30 days and to reject any future transactions of these listed institutions. It has also prohibited American citizens, American companies from doing any business with Russian banks. And these wide set of banking sanctions just against the VTB Bank, which happens to be the second largest Russian bank, is expected to hit about 80% of the banking sector in Russia. These banking restrictions are expected to hit Russia very hard because out of the $46 billion worth of foreign exchange transactions that Russia does every day, 80% of it is carried out through US dollars and US dollar denominated instruments. So the SWIFT boycott and the banking restrictions will operate in combination to disrupt the Russian economy and primarily its ability to transact with the rest of the world. These sanctions will have a further crippling effect because of the additional export controls that have been placed on key industries around the world from trading with Russia. The US and many other countries have led the way to impose a series of major export controls against Russia. The Bureau of Industry and Security under the US Department of Commerce has listed a set of sectors, goods, and exports which are prohibited from being exported to Russia. This covers sophisticated goods, softwares, and several technological products. It mandates the exporters to obtain new licenses for any export, re-export, or transfer of high technology products to Russia and covers a wide set of products including microelectronics, telecommunication items, sensors, navigation equipment, avionics, marine equipment, aircraft components, and even several products and components related to agriculture and pharma industry. Some of these sanctions do provide for exceptions so that it doesn't affect the Western companies themselves, as many of them treat Russia as a key export market for their products. But these exceptions will be reviewed on a case-to-case basis, and otherwise these export controls, they place a near total embargo on the export of key defense products and technologies to Russia, along with covering several other crucial and critical equipment, materials, and technologies. So these export controls and banking restrictions in combination is expected to hit several key sectors of the Russian economy, including aviation, the hydrocarbon sector, shipbuilding, defense, space technology, and this could end up crippling Russia's industrial base. The US government has stated that these restrictions have been designed to squeeze Russian access to finance and technology for strategic areas of its economy and to completely degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. So as these sanctions and restrictions affect Russian industrial and agricultural base, this could end up having a global impact on competitiveness and could also possibly lead to a commodity crunch, especially with regard to a few commodities and products where Russia is a leading producer. These concerns have been highlighted by the Bloomberg Commodity Index, which saw its biggest weekend rally since 1960 last week and gained by nearly 13% after Russia invaded Ukraine. Investors and economic experts around the world are fearing that we are going to witness a drop in the supply of essential commodities such as oil and metals, agricultural goods, and this would in turn affect the global economy, which is still struggling to recover from the pandemic. For example, look at the price of Brent crude oil. It has hit $120 per barrel, which happens to be the highest in a decade. So, as commodity prices shoot up due to the commodity crunch, it is going to result in inflation as well in several countries. And this could likely disrupt the global supply chains as well. In this context, it's very important to note that Russia is a key producer of certain commodities, such as oil, for example. In 2020, Russia produced about 12% of the world's oil and about 16% of the world's natural gas. It also produced nearly 50% of the world's palladium, which is a critical component in the auto industry that is used for manufacturing catalytic converters that helps in controlling emissions in the exhaust of a vehicle. So the global auto industry, which is already reeling under the impact of critical shortage in semiconductor chips, could take a further hit if the supply of palladium from Russia is also disrupted. Similarly, Ukraine as well plays a key role in the global economy. Ukraine accounts for 12% of the global wheat exports and 13% of the global corn exports. So, as the supply of these products are going to be disrupted because of the war and also because of the sanctions, it could potentially disrupt the global supply chains, lead to a global commodity crunch, and thus result in the shoot up of commodity prices. Now, let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: can artificial intelligence and machine learning put judiciary on the fast track? Analyze. The second question: will sanctions against Russia lead to a global commodity crunch? Examine its impact on long-term supply of wheat, oil, metals, and other goods. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So if you have found this session to be helpful, do like the videos, share your comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So with this, I would like to end today's analysis. Thanks for watching.